Thanks, Julie, and once again, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm joined by John because there's a crossover in terms of our discussions this morning, but I'd also like to acknowledge contributions by both Ruth Minogue and Jack Keys in the preparation of the actual paper itself, which, as I mentioned, will be available on the website later on this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So we're going to reflect on just a background to local government and why we think local government is, notwithstanding all of the reforms that have been undertaken in the last 5 years, why local government is still a critical issue for an incoming government. And we do so with a view to understanding the local government system in the public service context here in Ireland as being a Cinderella system, unlike most other parts of the public service in the OECD, where local government plays a critical role in the delivery of services to the body of citizens responsible for. And a critical element in that context, which will become clear, is the proposed National Spatial Planning Framework, which John will reflect on, and arising from that, environmental challenges that will confront an incoming government. And then we'll come back into the need for ongoing reform in the local government sector and suggest a number of conclusions and recommendations which hopefully will help in the commencement of a debate on the local government regime. Now, as I mentioned, the system in Ireland is quite limited in its mandate relative to the local authority systems we find generally across the OECD. Unusually, relative to the OECD, Ireland operates within a highly siloed, multi-layered regime. Now, Ireland's often described as being a centralised system of government. In fact, that's not correct. If we look at the characterisation of what a centralised system of government is, Ireland actually fails to meet many of those characterisations. Ireland is more accurately described as a disaggregated system of public management. And what I mean by that is that we have very highly siloed, layered systems with separate systems of accountability, separate systems of reporting. Ireland, unlike other countries, does not, at local government level, take the shared service platform role that you find local authorities in other systems across the OECD being responsible for. So we have moved down the road in public service reform terms of creating shared platforms on a thematic basis rather than on a spatial basis. And hopefully the importance of that will become clear in a few moments in the context of the National Planning Framework. Our existing local government reforms, certainly under the Putting People First policy document, have been the most extensive since the foundation of the state, in that it took on the challenge of dealing with urban government and trying to address the question of urban government and the style of support for urban government below the county level. In saying that, the jury is out in regard to the relative success or otherwise of the establishment of the municipal districts. And the jury is also out in regard to the mergers that have taken place, notwithstanding media coverage, in Limerick and in Tipperary and Waterford. And indeed, we've seen some debate in regard to the change process that's been suggested for Cork City and County. We, I think, are coming to a view that the current system as a whole needs to be examined, and not just examined in the context of the specific and current role and mandate of the local government process as it stands, but in fact its relationship with the wider public service. Because if we were to begin to get genuine citizen-based service delivery, we need to look at the relationship between local government and national government and the mandate that local government has in addressing citizen-based service delivery in a manner not unlike what we find in other reform processes across the OECD. So there is a clear need for a radically improved relationship between the local and the national and those that are charged with responsibility. That's all very fine and well, but I think it's important to reflect on the importance of local government even within its current limited mandate by understanding that it has a number of key roles to play in the national context as well as obviously at the local level. Something we very often underestimate in the Irish context in public service terms is the importance that local government brings as the primary framework for local democracy in the state. In effect, it is actually the only framework for local democracy in the state, local elective democracy in the state. And that plays a very significant role in underpinning the sense of identity. But it also plays a challenging role because, of course, much of our identity at local level is associated with structures which were created to kill home rule with kindness. In fact, Ireland is relatively unique. As the second oldest democracy in the OECD, it is relatively unique in that the originator of the local government system back in the 1890s could come back and look at the current system and feel quite comfortable with it. That would be very unusual in OECD terms. Now, admittedly, we didn't have the Second World War to interrupt the process of democracy, etc., or certainly not to the same extent as mainland Europe, but certainly the system that we currently have, and to which many people pledge identity because of sporting relationships, is based upon a process that was brought in the 1890s, replicating a process of democratisation in the UK generally at the time. But we underestimate that at our peril, that's for sure. But at the same time, how society functions in the 21st century is radically different from how society functioned in the 1890s by any standards. So how do we bridge those two seemingly incompatible challenges when we come to looking at the design of a fit-for-purpose local government public service? A second key role which is played, as I say, by the local authority system in Ireland, but a much lesser role relative to what we find in the rest of the OECD, is the process around democracy itself. And the levels of participation and civic engagement in the Irish context tend to be poorer relative to what we find in most other parts of the OECD. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One is that participation levels and the willingness to engage in local political action in other OECD members is in part influenced by the extent to which local authorities provide services. So people who are sending children to schools, for example, in other parts of the OECD will be interested in the local authority system because the local authority system is actually the patron or the responsible sector for primary and in some cases secondary education. And therefore they are motivated to be concerned about who is in running the show, if you like, at the local authority level. In Ireland, that clearly is not the case. So we have a relatively underdeveloped democratic framework here when it comes to active engagement and active participation. And that is also further an issue given the fact that we have so many part-time elected representatives working alongside a fully functional executive and professional body of people within the local authority system itself. And the balance therefore between the process of democracy and the process of executive function is skewed more towards the executive function than indeed towards the democratic process, again generally in contrast to most of the OECD. Our local authorities do provide a range of functions and services, a diminishing range of functions and services historically. We would have started out with independence and being responsible for issues like health and certain elements of education and so on. They migrated into essentially becoming engineering-driven bodies responsible for providing water and wastewater and roads and so on. More recently, as part of the reform process under Putting People First, there's an effort now to reorientate the local government system towards a more social role rather than an engineering-driven role, reflecting in part the processes of change that have been occasioned through reform processes in other parts of the OECD. But there's certainly some distance to go by any standards, and in some respects it's almost unfair to expect people who have been driven by a culture of engineering perspective to move and migrate into a culture that is socially driven, one of the great challenges for the staff and indeed the elected representatives within the local authority system. One of the key functions which has been given as part of the reform process is that of local economic development, which is seen as a significant initiative within the overall context of economic and social reform at the national level. But again, this has been part and parcel of the role of the local democratic process, again, within the OECD. So there's a challenge confronting the local authority system to move into the economic space at the local level in partnership with the likes of Enterprise Ireland and indeed the IDA. Another reason why local government is important is that it does tax locally. In fact, outside of the revenue commissioners, the local authority system is the only system that actually can tax you as an individual through property taxes and other forms of charges at the local level. So they are spending and will be spending money that belongs, if you like, to the individual property holder and the citizen. And therefore, there's a not unreasonable expectation on the part of citizens that if I'm paying money to my local authority, that I get something back in response. And that's quite different from the normal expectation in other parts of the OECD. A good friend of mine is the deputy city manager of a city the same size of Cork City in Germany. And I live in Fingal. And he was always intrigued, and his trips backwards and forwards to Ireland, he was always intrigued by the fact that Fingal County Council at the time gave me free wheelie bins, that I didn't pay for my water, that there was no property tax, that in fact the only charge I paid, because I felt guilty, the only charge I paid to Fingal County Council was a €20 licence for the Chihuahua, and which incidentally was about 1/8 of the licence charge for a similar type of dog in Germany where he lived. So things have improved at one level in terms of broadening the tax band by the introduction of property charges at the local level. But critically, and this is where we want to move into, local authorities in Ireland, probably the only area where they are truly independent, and certainly far more independent in fact than local government systems, ironically, in other parts of the OECD, is in regard to the spatial planning of our communities. Now, why is that important? In the past month, I've passed 35 years of work. I've been working for 35 years. Started out in the public sector, and the last number of years I've worked in the multinational sector and in the private sector here in Ireland. And in those 35 years, 1980 to 2015, the population of the island of Ireland has grown from just under 5 million people in 1980 to just over 6.5 million people now. And it's projected to grow, using the data sets, projections that have been put forward by the CSO here in the Republic and our counterparts in Northern Ireland, is projected to grow by another million odd people in the next 20 years, to 2035. And some commentators have suggested that our population on the island could grow upwards of to 10 million people in the next 35 years, to 2050. Now, that may seem like a long time away, but in 35 years' time, if I'm lucky enough, I'll be the same age as my mother-in-law. So a lifetime, if you like, in terms of 70 years, from starting work to hopefully being around in 2050, the population of the island of Ireland will increase by a population greater than the population of the Republic of Ireland was in 1980. And that's going to cause fundamental challenges to us, which means that we've got to begin to plan and deliver. The relatively ad hoc approach that has been taken to our planning processes over the last couple of decades, is that fit for purpose now in the context of a continuing growing population, a much more diverse population, a population where ageing is becoming, unfortunately for some of us, a critical issue. And in that context, does our local government system, as it currently stands, which was designed for an Ireland of the 1890s, which was agrarian, undereducated, is that system a system that is fit for purpose to take on board the challenges of such population growth and diversity and change generally? And with that in mind, it seems to me that perhaps arguably one of the most critical policy challenges confronting an incoming government is that of putting forward and setting the platform for where people will live over the next 20 to 35 years. And for that reason, we're bringing in this issue of spatial development and how it relates to the organisation of the local government system, and indeed, in the context of public service change, the organisation of the public service. So, John, if you want to come in and just give some background on that.
Thanks, Sean. Good morning. My previous employer, which is the Department of the Environment, has announced that the National Spatial Strategy, which was introduced in 2002, will be replaced next year with a new National Planning Framework. This will be capable of responding to the kind of very different economic circumstances we have now, and will have a more strategic focus than the NSS did. My intention this morning is to identify some of the lessons which we can learn from how the NSS was implemented, and I'll also look at the Scottish National Plan as a comparator. Excuse me. The NSS was designed as a 20-year framework to achieve more balanced regional development, primarily by developing critical mass in regional cities and towns known as gateways and hubs. It was also intended to set the policy framework, spatial framework, for public and private sector investment, for example, in transport. It was the first time that the department had introduced such an ambitious spatial plan, but unfortunately its implementation was seriously weakened by the financial crash in 2007-2008. There hasn't been any comprehensive or impartial review of the strengths and weaknesses of the NSS, but I think it is possible to identify some of its main features. On the positive side, the NSS was given statutory recognition in 2004 as providing policy guidance for lower tier spatial plans such as regional plans and city and county development plans. And this, in combination with the kind of core strategies which are now a statutory requirement for city and county plans, it should provide a more rational and transparent basis for zoning decisions. There's been substantial progress since 2002 in developing the interurban links between such as road and rail links. And some departments have introduced new spatial planning mechanisms. For example, the Department of Education has a whole division dealing with the planning for new schools and tying that into spatial planning. However, I think any review of the NSS should also address its shortcomings, and in particular the relative lack of integration between spatial planning and economic planning and funding. The timing of the NSS in 2002 was very unfortunate because it missed being integrated with the National Development Plan in 2000. The next one wasn't until 2006. That introduced a fund called the Gateway Innovation Fund, which would allow discretionary funding for gateway cities such as Cork or Limerick or Galway, but unfortunately that fund too was abandoned because of the financial crash. The NSS itself probably was a bit overly detailed. It probably had too many gateways and hubs. Now we have regional strategies, and it's possible to maybe delegate some of the regional focus down at that level and let the national spatial strategy focus on the main cities. That just this map just showing the red ones there are the main gateways, and the smaller green ones are the hub towns in support. There's 18 in all, which arguably is not a very effective way of prioritising resources. Again, Declan mentioned a comparison with Scotland, and I think that's also relevant in terms of spatial planning. Scotland is broadly similar to Ireland in terms of population size. It has many of the same kind of spatial issues as Ireland, and its system of governance, both central and local, is pretty comparable. So I think it is worth looking at their experience in terms of spatial planning. They're now on their third national spatial framework, and I think that's important because they review it every 4 to 5 years. I think one of the weaknesses of the NSS was there was no built-in mechanism, and we now have to go back to square one. I think it would be much better to review them every 4 to 5 years and adapt them to changing economic circumstances. And indeed, as we achieve certain goals, maybe roll them over and move on to the next ones. So what lessons can we learn from the Scottish experience? There'll be a map I'll come back to in a moment which will detail some of the national developments which they prioritise. There's a very strong focus on cities in the Scottish spatial plans. There's a great deal of literature now which says that cities are the main drivers of economic development in the regions, and the relationship between a city and its hinterland is very important. The majority of people in Scotland live in the cities, and they're the centres of main economic activity. It's one of the ambitions, and Declan talked about the need to be ambitious, to be a world leader in terms of low carbon energy generation. And again, you'll be hearing later on this morning about energy and climate change. And the Scottish policy there relates to both onshore and offshore development. So their spatial strategy shows where there's possibilities for synergies. For example, what port facilities might be needed to service the offshore renewable sector. So there's links, and indeed Ireland will be introducing marine spatial planning in next year or two as well under an EU directive. So again, this linkages between land-based and marine planning is quite important. And as I've said, the Scottish strategy is reviewed at regular intervals, which means it can be updated and respond to changing circumstances. The other important thing about the Scottish strategy is it's very much integrated into a whole of government approach. It's very, very closely linked with the Scottish Government spending plans, so you can integrate spatial planning and business planning both at central government and at local government level. Perhaps I'll just go on to the next map here. I don't expect you to read all of the details in this, but one of the important points, and something that we might sort of take on board, is that it flags developments which are critical to the development of Scotland as a whole. So some of the details they have here, for example, Ravenscraig, which is an old steelwork between Glasgow and Edinburgh. It's a huge derelict area which needs to be regenerated. Some of the lines there, the black lines, are the high voltage power lines which they propose. There are train links between Edinburgh and England. There are improvements to their main airports at Edinburgh and Glasgow. There are developments, for example, at Aberdeen there in the top. So it covers the whole sectors. The importance of putting these into the spatial plan is that they still have to go through a planning process, but at any planning inquiry, the need for these strategic developments is taken for granted because these are all government policy. But therefore, the only issue is, from an environmental point of view, are they the right choice and so forth. So the ordinary planning considerations kick in, but the strategic need is assumed. If they get planning permission, then they're built into the funding programme. So just to conclude, I think the implementation of the NSS has been patchy, but I think we can build on strengths and weaknesses. We still have much of the same challenges that they had in 2002. We still have significant regional disparities. As Séan has said, we have a growing population that looks to continue for the next 15, 20 years. We have a much more constrained budget situation than we had in 2002, but that does mean that capital programmes have to be more prioritised. And what we need, above all, is closer integration between spatial planning and economic planning.
Okay. So just to move on from that, the key lesson that comes through from the implementation of the strategic planning framework in Scotland is the institutional change that has been occasioned with the implementation of the frameworks over the last 15, 20 years. And as John pointed out, that was one of the weaknesses with the NSS, notwithstanding it being given a statutory foundation back as far as 2004. The reality is that its relationship to institutional change has been very patchy in the Irish context. And we've had almost twin-track processes in the reform of our public service and our local government sector in particular, with the intended implementation of a national spatial strategy. So one of the real challenges confronting government as it moves down the road of seeking to set a direction, a developmental direction for the state here in the Republic and indeed across the island of Ireland in the context of our relationship in Northern Ireland, is to attempt to address implementation of national direction in policy terms to actual implementation at local level through the existing planning framework. Because ultimately, the delivery of much of what is in the national planning framework rests within the policy responsibilities of this very disaggregated system that we operate at the local level. Arising from the various challenges that we've just talked about, there are very significant environmental challenges. The issues around actual engagement and debate with our public to understand the nature and extent of the development challenges that are going to confront the country as it moves into a population broadly similar to the population that existed on the island pre-famine. We have a relatively inadequate, although much better it has to be said than when the NSS was first developed, a relatively inadequate evidence base here. And quite often the debate around structure and institutional reform at the local level is uninformed or almost based upon mythology. And I think there have been several examples of that in the last 12 months, certainly, in the country. And certainly it stands in contrast to the evidence-based approach to reform that we find in other parts of the OECD. I mentioned earlier the unique features of our identity, and trying to understand that and apply it in the context of a robust and rigorous policy framework that is evidence-based. Because a lot of identity is based around the understanding and the sense of place that may be associated with specific areas, some of which are rural, some of which are urban. But what's very clear is that allowing for that identity, there is increasingly a need to have very urban-based policy direction under a national planning framework alongside a very rural-based policy direction. Traditionally in Ireland, we've operated on a universal policy role, certainly when it came to the design and delivery of local services. In the context of the crowding of the island, if you like, in terms of population growth, that has got to change. I don't think it's appropriate to continue planning for rural areas using urban policies and vice versa. We're going to have to look at a twin track, if you like, for both urban and rural. Key element to that is integrating our spatial planning into the management of the environment in a growing economy. Again, there are many challenges within that because it does challenge existing institutional perspectives on who is responsible for what and what may be delivered and developed in a particular urban and indeed rural context. And at the end of the day, do we have the systems in place to allow for those often competing demands arising from the nature and extent of the development that's likely to be needed in the country in the next 10, 20, 30 years? So do we have the tools available to us at the institutional level locally and indeed nationally to ensure that integrated thinking based upon concepts of sustainability are fully embedded into how we approach delivery of services and the addressing of development in both rural and urban contexts? Because local government is so central to our planning system, as I say, far more central in some respects to other parts of the OECD, is the current system fit for purpose? Is a rural-based system designed at a time of largely agrarian economy and underprivilege and economic and educational disadvantage, is that now fit for purpose for a country that is moving towards becoming more like an urbanised society, say Belgium, for example, in terms of population densities, etc.? And do we have the systems, as I say, in place that can underpin both rural and urban competences? Or do we need to begin to look at having separate types of systems? Is a universal local government structure now appropriate to how we design and deliver services? An interesting challenge. In other parts of the OECD that have gone through significant reforms, New Zealand, the Nordic countries, etc., they have created quite differing types of responses to how service delivery and proper planning and development is proposed and implemented at the local level in those particular countries. Is it time now for us to begin thinking in those terms? As John highlighted, a central feature and quite often ignored feature of the National Spatial Strategy has been the concept of the gateway and the city region. And there's no doubt that much of the population growth that we are looking at is going to be based upon our cities. And therefore, do we need to come up with a separate model of government for those city regions? The Dublin region, for example, assuming all of these population growths, is likely to be more familiar to Greater Manchester, which has 18 separate local authorities and the Greater Manchester Council. And the Greater Manchester Council doesn't take responsibilities per se, other than setting strategic direction for the 18 authorities, doesn't take direction directly in terms of service delivery, but is now, under the Osborne proposals for reform, taking on the responsibilities of Whitehall-based services in what was and still remains the most centralised country in the European Union. if we're looking at Dublin becoming a tier 1 city competitive region to compete with the Singapores and the Aucklands of the world, are we going to have to look at something similar for Greater Dublin? The greater challenge within that, of course, is political. Does the Taoiseach necessarily want to have a senior politician running the biggest economic unit, if you like, within the state? A challenge which, in places like Auckland and indeed the United Kingdom, they're confronting on a daily basis. One of the key issues, even with the reform process that has been undertaken, and as I mentioned at the start, the most radical reform process ever undertaken in the history of SAFE when it came to local government change, has been the lack of debate about what the nature of our local government system should be. And in a sense this is extraordinary, because our local authorities do determine where we live, how we live, where we recreate, where our children are going to recreate in the future, where they're going to live in the future. So in a sense, that lack of debate in the current round of reforms, can we afford to allow that to happen again as the population grows and the national planning framework is developed? And understanding in that context what we mean by citizen-centred service delivery. There's a lot in the public service reform plans about focusing on the citizen, the needs of the citizen. There's less in terms of thinking associated with what we mean by where citizen-centred service delivery should take place. Now, in most countries, those platforms are through the local authority system. In Ireland, traditionally, we've created thematic-based structures, and we're underpinning those structures now by nationally based shared service platforms. Whereas, as I say, in other countries, the shared service platform is the local authority. And as Declan pointed out, issues around performance and management. As local taxpayers, is it reasonable to expect that we should know how our local authority is performing, the range of services that are being delivered for the funds that are being put into those services? Ireland is relatively unique in the OECD in not having built-in performance criteria based on outcome policy measurements for the local authority system. In fact, it's relatively reasonable to say that quite often significant funds are being handed over to the local authority system and we don't necessarily know what the money has been spent on. And it's only with the recent proposals under the Putting People First process that we're beginning to move in that direction. If local government is to see an enhanced role in the context of what we've been talking about, how much more will we need to understand their performance and management? And associated with that, again, as Declan pointed out, is the leadership and transition. Now, it's fair to say that when the National Spatial Strategy was being prepared originally, there was an assumption that these factors would actually happen, that it would be a natural add-on or follow-on to the processes of change that the NSS were proposing. One of the big lessons that we've learned from is that we cannot assume that these things will happen, that there is going to need to be a critical pathway put in place underpinning a transition management programme for our local authority system if it is to continue to have a role in whatever context it finds itself, whether as a continuing 19th century creature or a reformed creature for the 21st century. What we're sure about is that change is a constant. And we're operating with a system, not just in the local government system, but across the public service, where change has created almost a legacy of lethargy and fear because there has been so much change. How much more change are we going to have to go through in the context of a spatial direction and development role that's been proposed here this morning?
Sean, can I just ask you?
Okay, I'm literally going to finish up here now. So much requirement and challenge confronting our local authority system, but that would only work if we have a robust and substantive debate about what Ireland is to look like in 2035 in time and alongside the development of the national planning framework. Within that, what is the actual role for local government? Are we happy to go along with the existing system, or do we actually need substantive change to the existing system to take on board the challenges of growth that are likely? And I think we would argue, and hopefully the national planning perspective will argue, that the cities will become the more effective drivers of regional economic development in this country. And that being the case, we need focused policy development for such cities, Cork, Dublin, Waterford, Galway and so on. And alongside that is increased financial autonomy. Again, a hallmark of regional government based upon city models that we find across the OECD is greater financial autonomy. But that has implications for our rural communities. Because if the effort is put into the cities to underpin economic development by investment in infrastructure, etc., it means that the rural areas are going to suffer the consequences of the diversion of resources into these city developments, unless an alternative policy framework is created for them. So fundamentally, I think the team around me in drafting this feel that a full and frank debate on how the local government system is to be reconfigured has got to be one of the top priorities for an incoming government if we're going to cope with the extent of growth that potentially, in population terms, that potentially confronts this particular jurisdiction. Thanks very much.